We'll see if this works. I have film clips on a PowerPoint, and I've never done the film clips in that format before. So if I'm the warm-up band for our next speaker, Professor Meltzer, who's the real thing. I was recruited by I was recruited by Matthew and Emil. I'm not a specialist, but they asked me to do this, and I said, sure, I'll see what I can find, and I'll report back to you. So that's what I'm doing today. I'm reporting back to you. Matthew, when he first pitched this idea, he said, oh, we'll have a round table. You just speak for 10 minutes. And maybe that's what that long introduction was all about. I only have 10 minutes left. Then 10 minutes became 20, and 20 became 30. So I do have 30 minutes here to fill up. So I can I can compress those if you like. Anyway, the full title is A Heady History, Salome and John the Baptist in English Literature. What exactly do I mean by my title, A Heady History? Well, as I found out in doing research, the biblical story of the daughter of Herodias has not produced a large body of work in English. That's not the worst of them, so get it's had a much longer and more satisfying run in French literature, as we'll soon find out, and it is this rich history about which Professor Meltzer will shortly speak. One scholar counted 2,789 items in Western culture between 1840 and 1920 pertaining to Salome. The vast majority of the better-known ones having been produced in France. Literary treatments by Flaubert, Mallarmé, Eastman, and Jules Laforgue, among others. And even the most famous one by an English author, Oscar Wilde's Salome, was written in French for a French actress and subsequently translated into English by Wilde's lover, Lord Alfred Douglas. Camelia Paglia characterizes Wilde's decision to write in French as a, quote, strategy of linguistic distancing, laying an impassable moat or English channel between the homosexual aesthete and the femme fatale. Wilde may have had another motive to engage in such linguistic distancing, namely covering a debt to an English language text of dubious quality, a dramatic poem on Salome by a young Harvard graduate, J.C. Haywood. It was published originally in Massachusetts in 1862, reprinted by the London publisher Kegan Paul in 1888, and reviewed by Wilde on February 15th of that same year. And here's an excerpt of Wilde's review. I feel sorry for anyone who is reviewed by Oscar Wilde. Mr. Haywood's Salome seems to have thrilled the critics of the United States. From a collection of press notices prefixed to the volume, we learn that Putnam's magazine has found in it, quote, the simplicity and grace of naked Grecian statues, and that Dr. Joseph G. Cogswell, LLD, has declared that it will live to be appreciated as long as the English language endures, that last phrase in quotes. Remembering that prophecy is the most gratuitous form of error, we will not attempt to argue with Dr. Joseph G. Cogswell, LLD, but will content ourselves with protesting against such a detestable expression as naked Grecian statues. If this be the literary style of the future, the English language will not endure very long. As for the poem itself, the best that one can say of it is that it is a triumph of conscientious industry. From an artistic point of view, it is a very commonplace production indeed, and we must protest against such blank verse as the following here, 6 lines from Haywood's dramatic poem. From the hour I saw her first, I was entranced or embosomed in a charmed world, circumscribed by its proper circumambient atmosphere, herself its center and wide pervading spirit, the air all beauty of color held dissolved, and tints distilled as dew are shed by heaven. In Haywood, it is Herodias, not Salome, who kisses the prophet's severed head. His Salome is far more innocent than the sexualized figure she becomes in Wilde, although I think critics widely acknowledge a debt on the part of Wilde to Haywood. In Heywood's long and lumbering poem, she is a would-be lover who is infatuated with John the Baptist and who subserviently fulfills the wishes and demands of her mother. It may very well have been Heywood's frightfully dull example that led Wilde to write his version in French, so as to avoid any suspicion of literary partnership with the still-living Heywood in the endeavor to make the English language endure. But if there is no body, no corpus, no torso of literature about Salome in English, there is most definitely a head. References to Salome and John the Baptist were not uncommon in medieval literature, where John is frequently a model of the ascetic life and outlook. In Chaucer's The Pardoner's Tale, John is mentioned in the context of the harm that may issue from drunkenness, as Herod was presumed to be intoxicated when he ordered John's execution. An early example of DWI, decapitating under the influence. The first original play written by an Englishwoman ever to be published, Elizabeth Cary's The Tragedy of Miriam, the Fair Queen of Jewry, features a character named Salome in a prominent, if not very flattering, role. Written in 1602-4 and published in 1613, the play was never produced during Cary's lifetime, and indeed remained fairly obscure until the surge of feminist criticism in the 1970s led to its rediscovery. And a welcome rediscovery. It's a really interesting play. Cary's Salome is a conflation of two Salomés, Herod's sister and the daughter of Herodias, just as her Herod represents a conflation of three biblical Herods. But her Salome is recognizable nonetheless as a representative of the unruly woman. Irrepressibly loquacious, Cary's Salome reinforces what Margaret Ferguson calls the ideological link between unruly bodies and unruly tongues. Her, quote, unbridled speech leads her into adultery and brings about the downfall of two husbands. Although the play contains no John the Baptist figure, it does, like the biblical story, engage issues of marriage and divorce, issues that were a pressing concern to the circles in which the Carys moved and which informed many later versions of the Salome story. Cary's Salome, like the play's protagonist, Miriam, finds herself trapped in a marriage to a man she does not love. Given a strong voice, she expresses her anger and frustration at the double standard on divorce. These are Salome's words. Why should such privilege to men be given, or given to them, why barred from women then? Are men than we in greater grace with heaven, or cannot women hate as well as men? I'll be the custom breaker and begin to show my sex the way to freedom's door. In Cary's play, Salome is the foil for Miriam, the strong, chaste, yet conflicted second wife of Herod, who chafes at marriage to the man who murdered her brother and grandfather, and she has discovered has ordered her own murder in the event of his death. Miriam is martyred in the manner of John the Baptist, and in one gruesomely comic scene near the end of the play, a rather mad Herod, who has figuratively lost his head, wonders whether there might be some strange ways of cure to reattach Miriam's head to her body and make her breathe again following her execution. Salome reappears in the 19th century, probably in response to two developments, a vogue for Orientalism in Britain and France, as Britain and France expanded their empires into the East, and anxieties about female power in response to the increasingly contentious gender politics of the late 19th century. Of the latter, Regina James writes, "Where there is a head, there is a crisis." The 19th century proliferation of Salomes coincides with unprecedented upheavals in the gender order. The angel in the house seemed to be taking to the streets, securing new laws relative to divorce and women's property, agitating for the franchise and birth control. In 19th century English literature, one may find occasional references to the biblical dancer, usually as a catalyst for the moral outrage that Victorians both perfected and satirized. It is hard to imagine a female public figure more antithetical to Salome than Queen Victoria, and perhaps it is her imposing shadow that caused the biblical figure to remain in the wings in Britain, while during the same period she danced her way across French literature with a vengeance. She does make a striking appearance in Robert Browning's dramatic monologue, Fra Lippo Lippi, of 1855. Particularly fond of this poem, but it's a hard, having tried to teach Browning a couple of times before, it's a hard sell. Anyway, I love the poem. The speaker of which is a Florentine monk and painter who's devoted more to the aesthetic than to the ascetic. Ordinarily boisterous and talkative, his tongue has been loosened further by drink, and he's being interrogated by some Florentine cops, watchmen let us call them, in the city's red light district late one night. He knows he has nothing to fear, as his patron is none other than Cosimo de' Medici. He complains to the guards of the hard life of a monk, particularly his having to carry on his relations with women in secret. The subject turns to questions that one rarely discusses with the police, except perhaps under the influence: the nature of art, and whether art ought to be idealizing and didactic or true to life. Should Fra Lippo's paintings of saints look like the men and women of the neighborhood, or should they look otherworldly and transport the viewer to a higher level of being? According to the church authorities, a painting ought not do, these are Browning's verses, homage to the perishable clay, but lift them over it, ignore it all, make them forget there's such a thing as flesh. Your business is to paint the souls of men. Fra Lippo cites the example of his painting of Salome with the head of John the Baptist, an appropriate subject for the monk, who in his intoxicated state is always getting ahead of himself. Sorry for repeating Michael's pun from earlier. He has painted his prior's mistress, euphemistically referred to as his niece, as the seductive Salomé, which shocks the prior, who wants an art that instigates to prayer rather than arousing the viewer's senses. Gazing at Fra Lippo's painting of Salome, the prior sees only his mistress. Let me see if I can get this detail. This is a detail from the painting that Grace showed earlier, Fra Filippo Lippi's The Feast of Herad. There's the detail of Salome with the head of John the Baptist. So gazing at Fra Lippo's painting of Salome, the prior sees only his mistress. Oh, that white, smallish female with a breast. She's just my niece, Herodias, I would say. The prior confuses the mother and daughter, as Browning is well aware. Herodias, I would say, who went and danced and got men's heads cut off. Have it all out. Fra Lippo justifies the realistic approach of painters like himself as opposed to that of a Giotto, an earlier style preferred by the aptly named prior. Paint the soul, never mind the legs and arms. By contrast, Fra Lippo advocates an art that does not separate head from body, as it were. Take the prettiest face, the prior's niece, patron saint. Is it so pretty you can't discover it, if it means hope, fear, sorrow, or joy? Won't beauty go with these? Suppose I've made her eyes all right and blue, and then add soul and heighten them threefold. Or say there's beauty with no soul at all. I never saw it. Put the case the same. If you get simple beauty and naught else, you get about the best thing God invents. That's somewhat, and you'll find the soul you have missed within yourself when you return him thanks. Browning's Fra Lippo joins flesh and spirit in a way that counteracts the original biblical legend, and this is, I think, a kind of a running theme in the English versions of the story that I've come to. That is the way that the decollation of John the Baptist kind of repeats the polarization of head and body, or flesh and spirit, in the hypersensual Salome and the ascetic, the hyper non-sensual John the Baptist. Both the spiritual saintly John and the hypersensual Salome equally prone to separate flesh and body, head from torso, whereas Fra Lippo prefers to see one as a window onto the other. The style of his painting antithetical to his content, Browning's Fra Lippo takes his rendition of the biblical story of the separation of a head from its body and the absolute separation of spirituality from sensuality as the occasion for suturing flesh and spirit. Victorians of the dour sort, of course, believed in the suppression of sensuality as a route to spirituality. In Sir Walter Scott's The Heart of Midlothian of 1818, the devout Presbyterian Davy Deans overhears his daughters speaking about a dance, which he denounces as a profane pastime. Dance for the elder Deans will prove to be the readiest inlet to all sort of licentiousness. Citing the example of the unhappy lass who danced off the head of John the Baptist, he moralizes that it were better to have been born a cripple than to be a king's daughter, fiddling and flinging the gait she did. In Victorian England, the story of Salome had become associated with a solemn, self-righteous opposition to singing and dancing. A certain branch of the extremely pious, Scott's novel suggests, cited the tale as evidence that music and dance could lead to gruesome murder. John Ruskin, in his Fors Clavigera, a series of letters addressed to British workers of the time, commented on Scott's reference to Salome that it exemplified the quote, deadly muselessness of those who would read of the daughter of Herodias dancing before Herod, but never of the son of Jesse, namely David, dancing before the Lord, and banished sackbut and psaltery, early forms of the trombone and zither, respectively, for signals in the service of Nebuchadnezzar, forgetting that the last law of Moses and the last prayer of David were written in song. Gender politics are frequently foregrounded in Hollywood cinema of the 1950s, and where they go, so goes Salome. In the next few minutes, I'd like to look briefly at two films from the period that allude to the biblical story. I'll skip over the nearly contemporary 1953 film of Salome, directed by William Dearly, and starring Rita Hayworth, Stuart Granger, and Charles Lawton. And about this film, if you really love camp, then you might want to check that out tonight. It's it's truly hilarious. But about this film, Sam Staggs writes, apart from Holy Land Camp, the only reason to see this cockeyed film is that in a real sense, Norma Desmond's script got filmed. Norma Desmond, the heroine of Sunset Boulevard. We'll see clips from that film in a minute. In a real sense, Norma Desmond's script got filmed at Columbia, not Paramount, 3 years after Sunset Boulevard. So what he means by that will become clear in a few minutes. Okay, I want to begin with a film that seems very far removed from the Salome story, Hitchcock's 1954 film Rear Window. It may be difficult to imagine Lisa Carroll Fremont, played by Grace Kelly, as Salome, but that is precisely what she asked us to do in the following clip.
Stuff going on out there. I wonder if it's ethical to watch a man with binoculars and a long focus lens. Do you suppose it's ethical even if you prove that he didn't commit a crime?
I'm not much on Rear Window ethics.
Of course, they can do the same thing to me, watch me like a bug under a glass if they want to.
Jeff, you know, if someone came in here, they wouldn't believe with it, see?
What?
You and me with long faces, plunged into despair because we find out a man didn't kill his wife. We're two of the most frightening ghouls I've ever known. You'd think we could be a little bit happy that the poor woman is alive and well. Whatever happened to that old saying, love thy neighbor?
You know, I think I'll start reviving that tomorrow. Yeah, I'll begin with Miss Torso.
Not if I have to move into an apartment across the way and do the dance of the Seven Veils every hour. Show's over for tonight. Preview of coming attraction.
Okay, and she may have more in common with the biblical figure than first meets the eye. Susan Hayward describes the cinematic femme fatale as, quote, active, intelligent, powerful, dominant, and in charge of her own sexuality, all of which apply to some extent to Kelly's Lisa. Lisa's line about dancing the dance of the Seven Veils every night slyly implies that Jeff himself is something of a tyrant, a Herod figure, though he also possesses attributes of the Baptist. The film's real Herod is the murderous Lars Thorwald, whose apartment they're gazing at across the way, in which role Hitchcock cast Raymond Burr because of his resemblance to his nemesis, producer and Hollywood tyrant David O. Selznick. Jeff, I've said, has attributes of a Baptist figure, not decapitated but temporarily incapacitated nonetheless at the knees, one whose ascetic lifestyle he rubs in Lisa's face. Earlier in the film he says to her, sometimes about his lifestyle that he thinks she is incapable of following. Sometimes the food that you eat is made from things that you couldn't even look at when they're alive. And of course the film has a severed head, not male but female. You might say that, like the body of the murder victim, Mrs. Thorwald, the story of Salome is carved up and distributed all over the Paramount Studio enormous set among several players: Lisa, Jeff, the dancer Miss Torso, and the pitiable Mrs. Thorwald. In this film, a kind of revisionist Salomé, it is a woman who loses her head, even as Lisa keeps hers, under very stressful circumstances, boldly entering the apartment of the killer while her male lover, wheelchair-bound and in a cast, sits by and watches helplessly, like a passive moviegoer. In the end, she cradles the admiring head of Jeff, who has just survived a fall through the window of the title. This is Miss Torso across the street. That's Miss Torso, and here she is cradling Jeff or Jimmy Stewart's head.
You got enough for a search warrant now?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Lieutenant Doyle,
Yeah?
he okay?
He's alive.
Thorwald's ready to take us on a tour of the East River.
You saying it was buried in the flower bed?
Yeah. He said the dog got too inquisitive, so he dug it up. It's in a hat box over in his apartment.
Want to look?
No, thanks. I don't want any part of her.
Like Filippo's representation of Salome, Lisa is the undivided woman, smart and intuitive as well as beautiful, active, and adventuresome, exhibiting no features of a disintegrated subject as implied by Miss Torso's perpetual motion dancing or poor Mrs. Thorwald's dissected body. Lisa, you might say, is the anti-Salome. In another film from the same decade, Billy Wilder's 1950 film noir, Sunset Boulevard, the story of Salome plays an even more prominent role. But the biblical story's role in the film, like the shooting star Norma Desmond herself, I intend that phrase literally and figuratively, she shoots her lover, has hardly received the attention it deserves. Norma Desmond, played by Gloria Swanson, is planning a great comeback, although she hates the word, with her own script, a sprawling epic treatment of the story of Salome, which she pronounces as if it were a sliced deli meat, to be directed by the prince of biblical epics, Cecil B. DeMille.
Young man, tell me something. How long is a movie script these days? I mean, how many pages?
Depends on what it is, a Donald Duck or a Joan of Arc.
This is to be a very important picture. I've written it myself, took me years.
Looks like enough for 6 important pictures.
It's a story of Salome. I think I'll have DeMille direct it.
DeMille? Uh-huh.
We made a lot of pictures together.
And you'll play Salome.
Who else?
Only asking. I didn't know you were planning a comeback.
I hate that word. It's return. A return to the millions of people who've never forgiven me for deserting the screen.
Fair enough.
Salome. What a woman. What a part. The princess in love with a holy man. She dances the dance of the 7 veils. He rejects her, so she demands his head on a golden tray, kissing his cold, dead lips.
They'll love it in Pomona.
They love it every place. Read it. Read the scene just before she has him killed.
Never let another writer read your material. He may steal it.
I'm not afraid. Read it. Max, bring something to drink. Sit down. Is there enough light?
I've got 20/20 vision.
I said sit down.
Well, I had no pressing engagement, except with those boys from the finance office. And she'd mentioned something to drink. Why not? Sometimes it's interesting to see just how bad writing can be. This promised to go the limit. I wondered what a handwriting expert would make of that childish scrawl of hers. Max wheeled in some champagne and some caviar. Later, I found out that Max was the only other person in that grim sunset castle. And I found out a few other things about him. As for her, she sat coiled up like a watch spring, her cigarette clamped in a curious holder. I could sense her eyes on me from behind those dark glasses, defying me not to like what I read. Or maybe begging me in her own proud way to like it. It meant so much to her.
As in Rear Window, dancing abounds at the New Year's party for two, which Norma Desmond hopes will mark the renewal of her Janus-headed career as both lover and as beloved star.
Joe! You look absolutely divine. Turn around.
Please.
Come on. Perfect, wonderful shoulders. And I love that line.
It's all padding. Don't let it fool you.
Yeah.
You know, to me, getting dressed up was always just putting on my dark blue suit.
I don't like the stud they send. I want you to have a pearl, a big luscious pearl.
Well, I'm not going to wear earrings, I can tell you that.
Cute. Come on, let's have a drink.
And there's another dance scene in her attempts to entertain her captive and soon-to-be martyr. Though certainly no holy man, the struggling writer Joe Gillis, played by William Holden, is by her own standards ascetic, not wanting to pay the terrible price for all the expensive gifts she attempts to lavish upon him.
I was getting bored. She would put on a live show for me. The Norma Desmond Follies. Her first number was always the Max Sennett Bathing Beauty.
Da 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 dee. I can still see myself in the line. Reprevost, Mabel Norman. Mabel was always stepping on my feet. What's the matter with you, darling? Why are you so glum?
Nothing's the matter. I'm having a great time. Show me some more.
All right, give me this. I need it for a mustache. Now close your eyes. Close them.
Something was the matter, all right. I was thinking about that girl of Artie's, that Miss Schaefer. She was so like all us writers when we first hit Hollywood, itching with ambition, panning to get your names up there. Screenplay by, original story by. Audiences don't know somebody sits down and writes a picture. They think the actors make it up as they go along.
Open your eyes.
Madame is wanted on the telephone.
You know better than to interrupt me.
Paramount is calling.
Who?
Paramount Studios.
Now do you believe me? I told you DeMille would jump at it.
It is not Mr. DeMille in person. It is someone by the name of Gordon Cole. He says it's very important.
Certainly it's important. It's important enough for Mr. DeMille to call me personally. The very idea of having some assistant call me, say I'm busy, and hang up.
Very good, madame.
How do you like that? We've made 12 pictures together, his greatest successes.
Maybe he's busy. Maybe he's shooting.
I know that trick. He's trying to belittle me. He's trying to get my price down. I've waited 20 years for this call. Now DeMille can wait until I'm good and ready.
angriest Charlie Chaplin I've ever seen. Wilder's film gives an interesting Hollywood inflection to the biblical story's emphasis on the polarization of sensuality and spirituality, curiously repeated in the severance of head from body. Joe observes that Hollywood seems curiously unconcerned with writers, and in this clip you saw that voiceover with Joe on the couch, framed by two scenes of dancing, as if to kind of reenact the polarization of script and writer on the one hand, and cinematic embodiment in the other. So writers on the one hand, director, actors, and film crew on the other. In the context of the biblical story of decapitation, it is hard to ignore the terrible irony that in this modern version of the story, it is Salome herself who repeatedly and figuratively loses her head. In her homicidal rage and subsequent madness, in this shot of her in an elaborate contraption meant to rejuvenate her appearance, and of course in this famous final scene.
Are you ready, Norma?
What is the scene? Where am I?
This is the staircase of the palace.
Oh, yes. Yes. Down below, they're waiting for the princess. I'm ready.
All right. Cameras. Action!
So they were turning after all. Those cameras. Life, which can be strangely merciful, had taken pity on Norma Desmond. The dream she had clung to so desperately had enfolded her.
I can't go on with the scene. I'm too happy. Mr. Emil, do you mind if I say a few words? Thank you. I just want to tell you all how happy I am to be back in the studio, making a picture again. You don't know how much I've missed all of you. And I promise you I'll never desert you again. Because after Salome, we'll make another picture and another picture. You see, this is my life. It always will be. There's nothing else. Just us. And the cameras. And those wonderful people out there in the dark. All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
Unusual way to end a film with a close-up, of course, that cuts off the head, but permanently severed from reality, she approaches the camera in such a way that separates her head, now the sole habitation for what she considers real in her psychotic state, from her descending body, possessed, as it were, by the spirit of the dancer Salome. Finally, two contemporary feminist poets give voice to Salome in two poems of the same name, one by Ai, an American poet who renamed herself after the Japanese word for love, and the other by Carol Ann Duffy, poet laureate of the still United Kingdom since 2009. Both are monologues. These are both on a handout that you should all have. Both are monologues spoken by Salome, and both appear on that page I distributed. I thought we might look together briefly at the one by Duffy. It appeared in a 1999 collection entitled The World's Wife, a project that Duffy herself describes as an attempt, quote, writing in different women's voices to give a fresh or subversive perspective on familiar stories or characters. Retelling stories that traditionally focus on men, Duffy tries to see them anew largely from the perspective of women previously hidden from history, Queen Herad, Mrs. Darwin, Mrs. Faust, Anne Hathaway, Frau Freud, even Queen Kong. I'll read her poem on the handout. I'd done it before, and doubtless I'll do it again sooner or later. Woke up with a head on the pillow beside me. Whose? What did it matter? Good-looking, of course, dark-haired, rather matted, the reddish beard several shades lighter, with very deep lines around the eyes, from pain, I'd guess, maybe laughter, and a beautiful crimson mouth that obviously knew how to flatter, which I kissed. Colder than pewter. Strange, what was his name? Peter? Simon? Andrew? John? I knew I'd feel better for tea, dry toast, no butter, so rang for the maid, and indeed her innocent clatter of cups and plates, her clearing of clutter, her regional patter were just what needed, hungover and wrecked as I was from a night on the batter. Never again. I needed to clean up my act, get fitter, cut out the booze and the fags and the sex. Yes, and as for the latter, it was time to turf out the blighter, the beater or biter, who'd come like a lamb to the slaughter to Salomé's bed. In tile mirror, I saw my eyes glitter. I flung back the sticky red sheets, and there, like I said, and ain't life a bitch, was his head on a platter. Duffy's is a morning after poem that represents the beheading as a casual incident brought on by a night of binge drinking. Her Salome cannot recall even the name of the man with whom she went to bed. Losing her head led Salome to cause her lover to lose his. Acknowledging Wilde's play as a major influence, Duffy describes her Salome as, quote, a spoiled, rich young woman who lives in considerable style with a lady's maid. She creates an atmosphere of modern-day decadence, echoing both the original biblical decadence in the gospel accounts of Mark and Luke, and the late 19th century decadence exemplified by Wilde. As the poem begins, Salome is waking up with a hangover and can't remember the events of the night before. Presumably after employing him to her advantage, making love to the man whose head lies next to her, she gives him the ultimate severance package. The poem has a cinematic quality noted by Duffy herself, with each of 4 verses, quote, focusing on one particular picture, the head on the pillow, the maid, the boozy lifestyle, the mirror, rather like a film camera cutting from one image to another, unquote. In addition to cut flesh and razor-sharp cinematic cuts from one stanza to the next, the poem features many caesurae, rhetorical breaks or pauses in the middle of a line from the Latin word for the act of cutting. And of course there are the sticky red sheets, echoing the famously frightening shot of the racehorse's head in Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather, a reference that Duffy herself acknowledges. Although Salome vows to reform and clean up my act, you can bet that in this decadent setting it is more likely her maid who will do most of the cleaning up. The poem exhibits a dazzling control of sound as rhymes and half-rhymes dance throughout the poem, ending on the thinly veiled climax, platter, which is anticipated by exact rhymes such as matter, flatter, clatter, patter, batter, and ladder, as well as by countless slant rhymes, butter, clutter, blighter, slaughter, and so forth. Duffy likens these rhymes or near rhymes at or near the end of her lines to drops of blood, which drip down the edge of the poem to pool with the final word of the original horrible image, the head on the platter. Though Duffy's Salome is ghoulishly callous, the poem manages to suggest in a single offhanded phrase, ain't life a bitch, that Salome, in Duffy's own words, quote, might have been badly hurt and damaged at some earlier stage. Browning's Fra Lippo aims to reconnect flesh and spirit, head and body in his visual rendition of the story. In Duffy's poem, it is Salome herself who, having lost all memory of the night before, inflicts on herself a figurative dissociation, a sundering of body and head. Thank you.